The humid Florida night clings to the skin like a wet shroud, heavy with the scent of salt water and the rot of hidden things. Behind the manicured hedges of the Palm Beach elite, a darkness began to fester, fueled by untraceable wealth and the silence of the powerful. Jeffrey Epstein was not just a man but a bridge, connecting the worlds of high finance, global politics, and the darkest human impulses. His wealth was a ghost, appearing in bank accounts like a phantom. Yet it brought him access to the most protected circles on Earth. In the early 90s, a web began to spin, drawing in those who thought they were untouchable and those who were too young to know better. The recruitment was a science of predation, identifying the vulnerable and offering them a glimmer of a life they could never afford. They were promised careers, education, and a way out, only to find themselves trapped in a gilded cage with no key. The names found in his flight logs read like a roll call of the world's most influential leaders, businessmen, and socialites. Among the most frequent mentions in early media reports and depositions was a certain New York real estate mogul named Donald Trump. During those years, the two men were often seen together, sharing the same social circles and a mutual interest in the Palm Beach lifestyle. Trump would later tell New York Magazine in 2002 that he had known Epstein for 15 years and called him a terrific guy. He noted their shared appreciation for beautiful women, a comment that would take on a much darker meaning in the years to come. But as the accusations began to surface, the friendship would be publicly distanced, leaving a trail of questions in the legal records. The files describe a world where the laws of normal society simply did not apply to those with enough zeros in their bank accounts. It was a system built on leverage, where secrets were the most valuable currency, and the victims were merely collateral damage. As we peel back the layers of these unsealed documents, the true scale of the corruption begins to emerge from the shadows. Welcome to a journey through the Epstein files, where the truth is more disturbing than any fiction you have ever heard. The unsealed court documents reveal a Rolodex of power that stretched from the halls of the Ivy League to the corridors of the Kremlin. Names like Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew appear in the testimonies of victims, painting a picture of a global elite bound by silence. These were men who moved the world, yet they found themselves frequent guests at properties where the unthinkable was routine. Testimony from Virginia Jeffrey describes a system where young women were lent out to Epstein's powerful friends like property. The psychological toll on these survivors was immense, as they realized the very people meant to protect society were their tormentors. Among the billionaires mentioned in the files was Leslie Wexner, the retail titan who gave Epstein total control over his vast fortune. This financial lifeline allowed Epstein to masquerade as a brilliant investor, though his true source of wealth remained a mystery. The files suggest that Epstein used his wealth to buy the silence and loyalty of those who could have stopped him years earlier. Even when he was first investigated in 2005, the legal system seemed to bend in his favor, resulting in a shockingly light sentence. The sweetheart deal orchestrated by prosecutors allowed him to continue his activities while supposedly serving time in a work release program. Victims watched in horror as the man who had stolen their childhoods walked free during the day to conduct business. It was a clear message to the world. Some people are simply too powerful to be held accountable by the standard rules of law. Bill Gates is another name that appears in the later logs, with meetings documented long after Epstein was a convicted sex offender. While Gates has expressed regret, the documents highlight the persistent law Epstein held for the world's most successful men. He positioned himself as a gatekeeper to intelligence and influence, a spider at the center of a web of high-level connections. But every web eventually breaks, and for Jeffrey Epstein, the ceiling was about to come crashing down in a New York jail cell. The secrets he kept were his insurance policy, but as the trial approached, many began to wonder who would benefit most from his silence. Ghislaine Maxwell was the sophisticated daughter of a fallen media tycoon, but she became the architect of Epstein's predatory machinery. She moved through the highest social circles like a ghost, scouting for young girls who looked like they were searching for a miracle. To the girls, she wasn't a threat. She was a glamorous mentor who promised them a world of travel, money, and luxury education. But once they stepped onto the private jet, the mentor disappeared, replaced by a cold administrator of a systematic human trafficking ring. Maxwell allegedly managed the schedules, the payments, and the intimidation required to keep the operation running for over 2 decades. She was the bridge between the victims and the powerful men who used them, ensuring the supply never met the demand for long. The court documents describe a grooming process so thorough that many victims didn't realize they were being trafficked until it was too late. They were taken to mansions in Palm Beach, New York, and New Mexico, where the walls were thick enough to swallow their screams. In these houses, Maxwell was often present, normalizing the abuse and making the victims feel like they were part of a secret club. She would watch, she would direct, and she would document, creating a library of leverage that Epstein could use against his powerful friends. This leverage was the secret to Epstein's survival, an insurance policy kept in safes and hidden rooms across his various global properties. But as the public pressure mounted, the woman who had spent her life in the spotlight began to retreat into the shadows of the world. Her arrest in 2020 sent shockwaves through the elite, as the person who knew all the secrets was finally in the hands of the law. Even in prison, the shadow of Ghislaine Maxwell loomed large, a reminder that the architect was still alive while the mastermind was dead. Her conviction provided a small measure of justice, but it did little to expose the men who had benefited from her systematic cruelty. The files she helped create remain largely under seal, protecting the names of those who once laughed at her dinner parties. Now, we look toward the island, the physical manifestation of Epstein's depravity, where the law simply ceased to exist for decades. Little St. James was a private paradise in the Virgin Islands, but to those who were brought there, it was a hell on earth. At the highest point of the island sat a strange blue-striped building known as the Temple, a structure that defied logical explanation. Locals whispered about what happened behind its windowless walls, stories of strange rituals, and the cries of young women echoing over the water. The island was a fortress, equipped with high-tech surveillance and a private security force that ensured no one entered or left without permission. Flight logs show that the Lolita Expresses frequented the island's private airstrip, carrying passengers whose names are known around the world. These logs, once secret, now serve as a map of the connections between Epstein and the global power structures of the 21st century. Bill Clinton's name appears dozens of times, though he has consistently denied any knowledge of the illegal activities that took place there. The documents suggest the island was a black site for the elite, a place where they could indulge their darkest desires without fear of discovery. Victims describe being flown to the island for days at a time, kept in guest houses, and forced to perform for Epstein and his associates. The isolation of the island was its most effective weapon. There was nowhere to run, and no one to hear a call for help. Epstein's staff on the island were reportedly sworn to secrecy, bound by non-disclosure agreements and the threat of financial ruin. But even the most expensive security cannot stop the truth from eventually leaking out through the cracks of a crumbling empire. When the FBI finally raided the island in 2019, they found a labyrinth of tunnels and rooms that hinted at a much larger operation. The images of the raid showed a place that was built for one purpose: the total control and exploitation of human beings. The island stands today as a silent monument to a failure of global justice, a place where the powerful were allowed to play God. As we move back to the mainland, we find that the same patterns of power and abuse were being repeated in the heart of New York City. The mansion on 71st Street was not just a home. It was the nerve center of a criminal enterprise that spanned the globe. The mansion at 90 71st Street was one of the largest private residences in Manhattan, a vertical palace of stone and secrets. Inside, the decor was a disturbing reflection of Epstein's psyche, filled with strange art and photos of himself with the world's elite. Visitors described a room filled with nothing but framed photographs of celebrities, royalty, and politicians, all smiling beside their host. This was the house where Donald Trump was said to have visited, a place where the boundaries of high society were blurred with something darker. Trump's Mar-a-Lago club served as a secondary recruitment ground, where Epstein was reportedly banned only after he crossed a line with a member's daughter. The relationship between the two men was a dance of ego and influence, a shared history that both would later try to rewrite. During the 2016 campaign, these connections began to leak into the public consciousness, though they were quickly overshadowed by other scandals. The files suggest that Epstein's New York home was rigged with cameras, capturing the activities of his guests for future use. This honey trap operation was allegedly designed to ensure that no one who entered the mansion would ever dare to speak against him. The FBI raid in 2019 finally breached the fortress, uncovering a massive safe filled with photos and a fake passport with Epstein's face. The discovery of these secrets confirmed what many had long suspected. Epstein was a man who lived 1,000 lives, all of them built on lies. As the walls of the Manhattan mansion were searched, the true scale of the horror began to emerge in the form of survivor testimonies. They spoke of massage rooms that were nothing more than sites for repeated sexual assault, sanctioned by the man who owned the house. The neighbors on the Upper East Side had seen the young girls coming and going for years, but they had chosen to look the other way. It was a conspiracy of silence, fueled by the prestige of the neighborhood and the power of the man behind the stone walls. But the silence was finally broken, and the shockwaves would lead all the way to the highest office in the land. The question remained: how many people were caught on those hidden cameras, and what would they do to keep them from ever being seen? July 2019 brought a humid New Jersey night, where the air felt thick enough to choke the engines of a returning private jet. As the wheels of Epstein's Gulfstream touched the ground at Teterboro, the invisible shield of his power finally began to shatter. Federal agents were waiting in the darkness, their faces illuminated only by the cold glow of their tactical flashlights and radio displays. The man who had flown across the world with presidents and kings was now being led away in a pair of standard-issue steel cuffs. News of the arrest rippled through the upper echelons of society, triggering a frantic scramble to delete emails and burn paper trails. In Washington and New York, phones began to ring in the middle of the night, answered by men who feared their names were next. Donald Trump, now in the White House, was asked about his former friend and claimed he had not spoken to him in years. The world watched as the billionaire's mansion was raided once more, this time with the full weight of the federal government behind it. Hidden compartments were forced open, revealing thousands of images that documented a lifetime of systematic, high-level depravity. For the survivors, it was a moment of terrifying hope, a chance to finally see the monster face justice in an open court. But the Metropolitan Correctional Center was a place where hope often went to die, a crumbling fortress of concrete and neglect. Epstein was placed in a cell where the cameras supposedly failed, and the guards supposedly fell into a deep, untimely sleep. The air in the facility was stagnant. Smelling of floor wax, old sweat, and the quiet vibration, rumors began to swirl that Epstein was being pressured to name his associates, turning him into a liability for the world's most powerful. He was a man who knew too much, living in a system that had every reason to want his story to end prematurely. On the morning of August 10th, the silence in the cell block was broken by the sound of a discovery that changed everything. The mastermind was dead, but the secrets he kept were now more dangerous than they had ever been while he was alive. The official report called it a suicide, but the world looked at the broken bones in his neck and saw a different story. How does the most high-profile prisoner in America vanish from a monitored cell without a single person witnessing his final moments? The guards on duty that night were later charged with falsifying records, claiming they had checked on him when they had not. For the victims, the news of his death felt like a final act of theft, a way to escape the judgment they had waited for. The trial that would have exposed the global web was suddenly cancelled, leaving only a mountain of paper and a void of justice. Conspiracy theories began to bloom in the vacuum of information, fueled by the sheer improbability of the official narrative. People looked to the powerful men who had visited the island, wondering who among them had the most to gain from his silence. The Doge's investigation into the prison's failures only deepened the suspicion, revealing a facility that was broken long before Epstein arrived. But as the years passed, the focus shifted from the death of the man to the life of the secrets he left behind. The unsealing of the John Doe files in 2012 brought a new wave of terror to the elites who thought they were safe. Names that had been redacted for years were suddenly exposed to the light, creating a public record of Epstein's vast social network. Billionaires and politicians found themselves having to explain why they had shared meals and flights with a known sexual predator. The files detailed meetings at the Manhattan mansion, weekends at the New Mexico ranch, and the dark trade that occurred between them. Even as the names came out, the lack of criminal charges for the men involved remained a bitter pill for the public to swallow. It seemed that knowing the truth was not enough to overcome the layers of protection that wealth and influence provide. The shadow of the island still hangs over every name in those files, a stain that can never be fully washed away by time. As we enter the final chapters of this ledger, we must confront the reality that for some, the game of power is more important than human life. Deep in the desert of New Mexico, the Zorro Ranch was a sprawling monument to isolation and the absolute power of its owner. The main house was a fortress of glass and steel, designed to allow Epstein to observe everything while remaining completely hidden. Workers at the ranch spoke of strange underground bunkers and a plan to create a human seed bank, a project born of eugenics. Epstein allegedly wanted to use the ranch to populate the world with his own offspring, a twisted vision of a genetic dynasty. High-level guests were flown into the ranch's private airstrip, away from the prying eyes of the public and the local authorities. The documents mention visits by scientists and intellectuals, men who were lured by the promise of funding for their fringe theories. But the ranch also served as another site for the abuse of young women, many of whom were brought in from the surrounding areas. The vastness of the New Mexico desert ensured that any attempt at escape would be a journey into a lethal, sun-scorched void. It was here that Epstein felt most like a god, distant from the laws of man and the constraints of civilized society. When the FBI finally arrived at Zorro Ranch, they found a place that felt more like a research facility than a private home. The sheer scale of the property made a full search nearly impossible, leaving many to wonder what remains buried in the sand. Locals in the nearby town of Stanley had long suspected that something was wrong, but the money Epstein poured into the community bought silence. It was the same pattern repeated everywhere: the corruption of the local through the overwhelming wealth of the global elite. The files described the ranch as a breeding ground, a term that highlights the dehumanizing nature of Epstein's world. Today, the ranch stands as a hollowed-out husk, a reminder of the darkness that can flourish when wealth is the only law. As we turn back to the files of the powerful, we see the names of those who were willing to ignore the ranch's true purpose. The question is no longer what happened, but who was allowed to watch it happen without ever saying a word. From a luxury apartment in Paris to the quiet streets of London, Epstein's reach was truly global, a shadow across 2 continents. The Unsealed files describe his interactions with international figures like Prince Andrew, whose reputation would be permanently damaged by the connection. Testimony from survivors like Joanna Sjoberg paints a vivid picture of the casual nature of the abuse within these high-end settings. Epstein used his international properties to move victims between countries, exploiting the legal loopholes of different jurisdictions. In London, he met with members of the royal family, using his wealth to gain a level of social standing that shielded his crimes. The files suggest that Maxwell was instrumental in these European operations, using her family's name to open doors that would otherwise be closed. Each new location was another cell in the web, another place where the laws of the world were replaced by the desires of the powerful. The names in the files are not just American. They include French politicians, British aristocrats, and international business moguls. This was a global elite that shared more than just business interests. They shared a secret that bound them together in a pact of silence. When the news of the scandal broke, the response across Europe was a mirror of the American panic, a desperate attempt to sever ties. But the digital trail is long, and the survivors are no longer afraid to speak the names that were once whispered in fear. The files detail the use of private jets to bypass customs, moving cargo that consisted of terrified young human beings. This was a logistical operation of evil, coordinated with the precision of a multinational corporation. The French investigation into Epstein's Paris apartment revealed yet another layer of systematic exploitation within the heart of the city. The global web was a machine designed to grind human lives into a currency that could be spent by the most powerful people on Earth. As we approach the end of the files, we see that the machine is still turning, even if its main operator is gone. The shadow is long, the secrets are deep, and the world is still waiting for the full truth to emerge from the darkness. The ledger of Jeffrey Epstein is a document of a broken world, where the pursuit of power led to a complete loss of humanity. Names like Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and Prince Andrew will forever be linked to this story, regardless of their legal innocence. The Unsealed files are a testament to the resilience of the survivors, who refused to let their stories be buried with their abuser. But the true cost of this conspiracy can never be measured in documents or court cases. It is written in the lives that were destroyed. We look at the mansions and the islands and see not luxury, but the physical manifestations of a predatory system. The web was built on the silence of the powerful, a silence that was bought and sold in the most expensive rooms in the world. Even now, there are names still redacted, secrets still hidden, and men still walking free who know exactly what happened. The question remains whether our system is capable of holding the truly powerful accountable, or if justice is only for those without influence. The victims continue to fight for the truth, even as the world tries to move on to the next headline and the next scandal. This is not just a story about one man. It is a warning about the dangers of unchecked wealth and the vulnerability of the innocent. The ledger of shadows is still being written, and every unsealed document adds a new line to a history of global corruption. We must never forget the names of the victims, and we must never stop asking the names of the men who were there. The island may be empty, the ranch may be silent, and the mansion may be sold, but the trauma remains in the bones of the survivors. For some, there will never be closure, only the quiet endurance of a truth that the world was too afraid to acknowledge for decades. The shadows are deep, but they are not empty. They are filled with the voices of those who refuse to be forgotten. As the sun sets on this investigation, the darkness feels more permanent than ever, a reminder that the world is not always what it seems. Sleep well tonight, but remember that the ledger of shadows is never truly finished, and the silence is never as empty as it sounds. This is Midnight Country, where the darkest stories are told after midnight. Subscribe, stay alert, and never trust the silence.